In today's video, we are dedicating ourselves to very important core questions and also specific questions from your side. Among other things, when can we finally expect a trend reversal to occur? What needs to happen? We will discuss important data that will still take place in March. Otherwise, I will address a question here regarding what my outlook is for 2025. Will there possibly be a summer slump 2.0? What are the probabilities in this regard? We will address this specifically regarding seasonality. Otherwise, I will address further important core questions, including those circulating on Twitter, suggesting that there is virtually no real bull and bear market anymore. There is no real altcoin season anymore. And the 4-year Bitcoin cycle has also been broken. This time is different. We are practically living in a different market at the current time, so I will also share my personal opinion on whether I agree with all of this or not. Therefore, make sure to stay tuned until the end. We also see new updates regarding Donald Trump's master plan. So definitely watch the last video as well, in case you missed it. Otherwise, feel free to leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss any further videos. I think it's quite important to stay up to date at the current time, and I also try to only produce videos when I have new, relevant data for you. Not like other YouTubers who force out a video every day, but I personally focus on producing a new video for you only when I have truly gained new insights from the market. Otherwise, here again, we currently see that traditional markets are still being sold off. Overall, we have seen a 9.7% decline in the S&P 500. Why is this relevant for crypto as well? You have to imagine still, there is a correlation between traditional markets and Bitcoin. And as I said, it's extremely relevant to understand because we have seen massively bullish news, especially in the last few days and weeks, around crypto, around Bitcoin in general. So I would say the last 2 or 3 months, especially this phase here actually, since Donald Trump took office, we have consistently seen positive news, purely crypto, intrinsically. And that's why we currently see that Bitcoin is still holding relatively strong. I also mentioned this in the last video, that since Trump's elections on the 5th of November, Bitcoin has remained positive. And in the traditional markets, we are in a negative position since the 5th of November. So it's important to understand that crypto still shows relative strength at the current time compared to traditional markets. Normally, Bitcoin should be significantly lower, even if many don't want to hear it. Because of course the altcoins have been abolished twice, 3 times, 4 times as strongly. But still, it must be clearly acknowledged that Bitcoin is still holding up reasonably well. Now, of course, I already see the first thoughts and concerns from people here out there that perhaps a second summer slump is happening. And I have to honestly ask you all the question, or especially to those, how do you come to the conclusion that just because the sun is shining outside, there has to be another summer slump? So in my opinion, this concern is completely unjustified. And I can justify this quite simply. We see here the seasonality, and clearly there is a certain trend that is evident. I would say especially the cooler months, and particularly October and November, are usually very, very bullish for the crypto market and markets in general. And to briefly highlight the background here, it simply has to do with the fact that many investors, especially investors, often sell their positions in May to essentially go on summer vacation. But in my opinion, this is a very minor factor that influences the market. We have completely different factors that are much, much more relevant. And I also like to recall the last bull run. And I can certainly understand why this concern exists, or rather why this thesis is prevalent out there, that another summer rally might occur. Simply because if we compare it to the last cycle, we also saw an interim peak in May and then only later, Q4, October, November, the next peak. And that of course speaks to the seasonality of Bitcoin. But it should be clearly stated here, especially during this time, we witnessed the DeFi summer. So there was a lot happening, and the bull run was still intact. Because it is relevant to understand why a summer lull occurs at all. Yes, and of course it has several factors, as already mentioned, there are naturally. The argument that many investors go on summer vacation and accordingly sell off their positions and exit risk on assets is theoretically a valid argument. In my opinion, however, it is much, much more important to understand the current state of liquidity. And here, once again, I have prepared a chart for you, which I had already shown in the last video. We can clearly see here, during the last summer slump in 2024, it was also a very grueling phase. We could clearly recognize that global liquidity was reduced. Overall, on a net basis, less liquidity entered the markets. And ultimately, that was also the reason why Bitcoin stagnated. And it is extremely important to understand the connection between liquidity and prices themselves, because at the end of the day, this is the ABC of the capital markets. Only when liquidity is present is the fuel also provided for rising prices. It's like a car that has an empty tank. It's clear that it won't move forward. And just as it is important for fresh liquidity to come in so that prices can rise. And that's why, logically, we saw this so-called summer slump at exactly this time. If the whole thing had happened in winter, then we would suddenly have a winter slump. So I can just as well provide a counterexample also back then with the absolute bull market. We also see a bottom, here here, October, November, December were absolutely negative and bad months. So the whole thing can also be illustrated here with a simple counterexample. It doesn't mean at all that just because it's summer outside, just because the sun is shining, that prices will suddenly collapse. So that is completely unjustified. If we consider the whole thing here as a fact and as a prerequisite that we need increasing global liquidity here for higher prices, then we just need to take a look at what is currently happening with global liquidity. And there we have a relatively simple picture, or rather it is very, very, very clear why global liquidity is increasing. I'd already mentioned the whole thing in the last video. I don't want to go too deeply into the background anymore. Among other things, this is of course also due to the fact that the current US dollar is weakening. And accordingly, we are getting an expansion of the M2 money supply. And it has always been a precursor to where prices will subsequently develop further. And that is, I would say, one of the most important indicators I am looking at the moment. If we consider the time lag here from the past, we have a relatively clear picture. We see a lead time, or rather, a time lag of 75 days, both on the negative side, meaning as soon as the M2 money supply is decreasing, we then see in retrospect that Bitcoin falls, and conversely, as soon as the M2 money supply increases, we also see as a result that Bitcoin increases, based on this derivation. And since we already have the data showing that we see a local bottom here, meaning a local low, with global liquidity, we can roughly assume, of course, there are different scenarios that we will see the next pump at the end of March, or rather, that this long downtrend will end. And we can see that again here. There is another chart where it is not quite as strong, depending of course on how you measure global liquidity. In that case, it would be the end of April, but I personally also assume that at the end of March or during April, we will see the next pump. And also the next leg up for Bitcoin, that's why, in my opinion, complete nonsense, or rather, simply completely unfounded. So you are welcome to share your reasons or your opinion in the comments. Do we see a second summer slump? Yes, especially now in 2025, for me personally, very unrealistic. So quite a bit would have to happen again, which of course is possible. It should also be clearly stated we are still in an overarching downtrend. So it's important to understand that we also have the traditional markets here, which are making one new low after another. And honestly, this whole thing can last a few more days, and maybe even a few weeks. It could very well be that we only see the reversal here, which in this case would be the beginning of April. And it could also lead to Bitcoin, as mentioned, returning to 70,000, 72,000 US dollars. So you have to take that into account. But sooner or later, in my opinion, we will see significantly higher prices again. And sooner or later, we will also see new all-time highs for Bitcoin again. And all of this even in 2025. So also here, the opinions that somehow a bear market is being initiated now. For me, that's relatively unrealistic. So at the end of the day, I obviously don't have a crystal ball either. I only act based on analyses, based on probabilities. But the current data situation still looks relatively good in my opinion, which is clearly a factor here. Now we will also talk a little bit about the outlook for March 2025. This is extremely important. What will happen in 6 days at the next FOMC meeting? This could, of course, lead to a great disappointment because it might be the case that what we currently see in the markets is not yet sufficient for the Fed. We are seeing these strong sell-offs. That this principle, which I explained in the last video, that Trump is doing this intentionally so that we suffer in the short term to emerge stronger later with a stronger and better foundation. That is, I would say, the strategy behind Trump at the current time. And that's why it will be extremely relevant what happens here on the 19th March. If we don't manage to announce major changes, or if there is potentially a better outlook for 2025, because you have to imagine there doesn't necessarily have to be a change. There doesn't necessarily have to be an interest rate cut, which is completely unrealistic anyway. Which is completely unrealistic for March 2025 anyway. We see the current statistics 99-1. It's more about what Jerome Powell says in the press conference. What is the outlook regarding QT, meaning the current quantitative tightening we are seeing? So these are all points we need to pay attention to. And of course also the outlook for the 7th May. In the worst case, it could lead to things getting even bloodier, and only from the 7th of May, we might receive more positive signals from the Fed, which could certainly happen. And this is also my personal opinion. The longer this whole situation drags on at the current time, if it continues to drag on, towards June, July, August, September, if it takes until then for us to receive more positive signals, then it could very well be that we won't see the next peak or the next upswing until Q4 2025. That is, let's say, the worst case scenario. What could happen? Sooner or later, however, we will see higher prices again, even without a bear market. I would like to make a bit of a transition here to an opinion on Twitter, which I don't agree with 100%, but partially do. What I want to highlight here is actually exactly what I just explained about global liquidity. And in this regard, I could certainly imagine that this 4-year cycle is actually no longer as it used to be, as we imagine it. Or rather, as it was in the past with Bitcoin and crypto in general, simply because you have to imagine. The current investors who have invested here in Bitcoin who have accumulated heavily were largely major institutions. Yes, and not necessarily retailers, not necessarily private money. And that's why I also say that crypto is becoming more and more established and increasingly linked to the traditional market. And that's just how it is, or rather, this is an argument from my side. Personally, I can't imagine that if we see an extremely strong rally sometime in 2025, 26, 27, in the traditional market, that crypto will be completely dormant, that nothing will happen with Bitcoin, and that Bitcoin will enter a deep bear market. And that's why I'm personally not really convinced that these 4-year cycles will play out to such an extreme extent. I think, nevertheless, we still have cycles. At the end of the day, everything operates in cycles. We also see clear cycles concerning the money supply. So that will still be present. But in my view, the extremes will not be as pronounced anymore. To be honest, I can't really imagine that in this cycle, Bitcoin will correct more than 80% again, similar to the last cycle or just under 80%. So I think the general ups and downs will not be as strong anymore as far as Bitcoin is concerned. And I can also imagine that this cycle in general will stretch out a bit more. Because as I said, if monetary policy is aimed at benefiting risk-on assets, having a weak US dollar and low interest rates, then I can't imagine that Bitcoin and crypto won't follow suit. They will also benefit from it, just because we are no longer in the exact 4-year cycle. In my opinion, there's also nothing against the possibility that we might even see a bullish 2026. So, in my view, you can't completely rely on this. 100% on the entire seasonality and the cycles themselves. We've seen it now. Everyone thought February would be incredibly bullish, incredibly green, and exactly the opposite happened. And I can imagine something like that happening again here, that exactly the opposite will occur, for example, in the summer of 2025. So I just want to highlight a bit here, based on certain arguments, that it doesn't always have to be the way everyone thinks, that the cycle has to play out exactly in a certain way. So I definitely have a different opinion on that. I think there is still a kind of clockwork in place, certain parameters interact with each other or harmonize with one another. That's why certain principles and the rule set itself still exist within the crypto market. But still, it's important for me to show, what does the overarching picture look like? And above all, what is the larger trend doing? What are the traditional markets doing? What does the global liquidity situation look like? In my opinion, it has a greater impact than seasonality itself. Otherwise, I would like to address another point from this tweet where I, for example, do not agree. It was claimed here that there will be virtually no real altcoin season. I definitely do not agree with that, simply because it will be a logical conclusion. When Bitcoin enters the overheated area, when Bitcoin dominance falls, in my opinion, it is a logical conclusion that a real altcoin season will occur. Just as we have seen the whole thing in recent years, in my opinion, it is almost set in nature that investors become greedier, that investors focus more on altcoin projects, essentially on projects that are somewhat riskier, where one can potentially gain even more. As soon as Bitcoin is in the overheated area, when Bitcoin is simply no longer marketed or fairly valued, in my opinion, it is a logical conclusion that we will also see an altcoin season. So, I definitely do not share the same opinion there, but I do partly hold the view that these 4-year cycles definitely need to be questioned, simply because Bitcoin and the entire crypto space have become more institutionalized. More institutions are invested, and therefore we have similar investors both in Bitcoin and in the traditional market. And that's why I can't imagine that Bitcoin will significantly weaken if the S&P is doing extremely well, because as I said, the correlation has, in my opinion, become increasingly stronger over the past few months. So I think this is a relatively clear and simple observation, which, as mentioned, can be relatively easily justified. And therefore, to reiterate the concluding statement, I would be surprised if Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies in general enter a 3-year bear market when the S&P 500 is hitting one all-time high after another. So something really bad would have to happen, especially with the current positive developments, because such a scenario for crypto is very, very unrealistic. And that's why I'm not worried at all that in the coming months, we will see new all-time highs in the overall market again. That's definitely all on that topic. I think you've gotten a relatively good overview. Otherwise, I would like to address one more point here, where you also have the opportunity to gain something extra. It's also very important to me that in the current market phase, we take advantage of every opportunity where you can essentially get something for free. And there is currently an opportunity from Bitmart. They contacted me due to their 7-year anniversary. We can see here that a big event is taking place over the next 11 days. Here we can see what has happened over the past years. And afterwards, we can see here the opportunities we have to snag some winnings. This is simply an opportunity I want to highlight where you have the chance to grab some decent prizes. You can definitely check it out. Also linked, we can see the conditions here, and you definitely have the opportunity to win quite a bit. I definitely think it's a top-notch promotion, especially for the 7th anniversary. It's definitely worth participating here. The whole thing is available for 11 days. I personally have also created an account here on Bitmart, so you are informed about it. Otherwise, as I said, you are definitely informed here. Now, I would like to address a point again also on the topic of bull and bear markets. In my opinion, it simply makes no sense that the current cycle top is represented here. You have to imagine one of the main indicators is the P-cycle top indicator. I personally am actually somewhat critical of this indicator because I personally am also of the opinion that a crossover does not necessarily have to occur between the two EMAs. So these are essentially two average values that are formed here. And as soon as a cross occurs, the cycle top is officially reached. That's basically how this indicator works. To be completely honest with you, it doesn't necessarily have to happen in this cycle that both lines cross. I prefer to be a bit pessimistic, a bit conservative, but still I want to address one thing here, even if one doesn't. Assuming that a crossing is needed to represent the cycle top, it is still the case that we are currently even below the orange line. So, to illustrate this a bit more and to zoom in on it regarding the last cycle and the current cycle, we are nowhere near docking from the orange to the green line. So that's one thing. And on the other hand, we have actually broken down below the orange line for the first time, so to speak, below the lower EMA. And that's why, in my opinion, it's by no means an indication that the cycle top has already been reached. We haven't even temporarily reached 100,000 US dollars, the upper edge, meaning the upper EMA. So we were definitely not yet in the overheated zone with Bitcoin. There was definitely still a lot missing, and that's why I also believe that the whole thing will continue to play out here, and that sooner or later we will also come back above the orange line, and not necessarily completely plummet here, like in the last cycle. As I said, we also had a clear cycle. Top achieved, it was a relatively clear on-chain signal. Now in this case, at the current time, as I said, we are still far from it. That's definitely all there is to say about that. It was important to me to mention the whole thing again, otherwise I would like to talk a bit about some news that we have seen on one side from Deutsche Bank. And indeed, we see here that Deutsche Bank claims Bitcoin is like gold. And we should take it as an example regarding the current US strategic reserve. So it is definitely positive to see that Germany is also stepping forward and participating in these developments. We also see that this master plan of Trump is working out. I would like to bring up one more thing. Yesterday, Trump stated that the current inflation data is very, very good and also very, very good news. And this is exactly what I explained in the last video, that there is a certain master plan in place here from Donald Trump to cut the interest rates in order to refinance these 9 trillion more cheaply and affordably. So it's very important to understand that you also have the connections here. Otherwise, we also see another statement from him here, which you can also check out on Watcher Guru. And indeed, Trump once claimed, I believe, the markets will skyrocket. So here in German, claimed in that sense. And it is exactly the master plan that he is pursuing. We are going through the crisis now. We are suffering now. He is deliberately putting pressure on the markets now in order to force the Fed, in this case, to cut interest rates so that we see a loose monetary policy again. Because you have to imagine Trump, but also Musk, of course, both want to benefit from it at the end of the day. When I take a look at the Tesla stock and observe the whole situation, what is happening here is a total of minus 51%. Or in this case, even minus 55%. It is truly astounding what is happening here as well. So I can't really imagine that this will last forever. What now? The crash also affects the traditional markets. So there is already a relatively clear plan behind it. Yes, Musk knows exactly what he is doing, and Trump as well. Many want to portray Trump in the media as somewhat foolish, which I can understand to some extent. His statements are definitely very, very mixed. One moment he claims this, another moment that. But in my opinion, at the end of the day, he still knows what he's doing. So in my view, he is not this fool. Yes, as it is always claimed in the media, in my opinion, there is a clearly thought out plan behind this. Feel free to write your opinion in the comments. Do you share the same opinion as I do personally? Do you also think that Trump is following a clear plan? Or do you think Trump is just doing something without any clue? So I would definitely be interested in knowing what your opinion is. Otherwise, as mentioned, that was it for today's update. Also here we see trueflation continuing to decline. So we definitely see very clearly that the individual parameters are slowly but surely playing into our hands. Now finally, I want to talk about the bots. I want to be 100% transparent with you, because, as I mentioned, I uploaded a video a few days ago about the self-experiment, and I also said here that I want to give you a little update in almost every video. We can clearly see that some trading bots are significantly underwater, or rather, it's still within limits. Here, minus 20%, minus 10%, minus 2%. So we can clearly see that the trading bots are not performing particularly well in negative market phases. Yes, it was of course clear to me from the beginning, because you have to imagine I have aligned all trading to ensure that we make decent profits when the prices and the overall market are doing well. These are all nonsense. Trading bots, we see here bullish. So you can set the whole thing up here at the top on Pionex. Sideways, bullish, bearish. Now in hindsight, one is always wiser. Now I'm a bit underwater, Personally, I am still optimistic that we will return to profit here as well. Otherwise, I would like to incorporate another bot for my YouTube videos. Specifically one that is geared towards a bearish market situation, namely a reverse grid bot. I want to apply the whole thing to Bitcoin. I want to set the upper limit at 90,000 US dollars and the lower limit just as a safeguard. The 60,000 US dollars with a total of 250 grids which will be bought and sold repeatedly, yes, or rather here 150 is the maximum, and then I will also set $800 here at this point, and I will do the whole thing in this case. Again, with a total of 0.009 Bitcoin, so in this case, you have to set up the whole thing with Bitcoin, which is approximately 800 US dollars. And now in this case, I set up the whole thing basically with Bitcoin because it is a reverse grid trading bot. You have to deposit the margin as Bitcoin. That's why in this case, 0.09 Bitcoin is approximately 800 US dollars. Now I approach the whole thing here, click on continue. And then we can see here with the trading bots, now we have set up a new bot, or rather, it is starting now. In this case, it is a reverse grid trading bot. It is essentially a bot that benefits significantly more when prices fall. I just want to demonstrate and initiate the whole thing here as a type of hedge in case the market should drop further, so that I have at least one bot aligned for negative phases. If the whole thing would load, we can see here, it definitely takes a while to load. So just so you are aware, we can now see here how all the grids are being set up. In total, I've set up 150 grids. And we can clearly see here how this bot has started. So I'm curious to see how a negative bot works here as well. As I said, it's purely a self-experiment. Just as I mentioned in this video, it's better to watch me first. And after about 30 days, you can form your own opinion and then try out the bots yourself. Otherwise, if there's interest, I've linked Pionex as well. In my bio, as mentioned, is my current partner exchange, so you are well informed there. There's even an event going on, so you also get a small deposit bonus, so you're definitely up to date. Otherwise, that's it for today's video. It was a pleasure to gather everything for you today. Feel free to write in the comments, what is your assessment? What is your current opinion on the current market situation? I know it's very, very frustrating at the moment, but in my view, the future still looks very, very positive. So we can definitely look forward to quite a bit. I think now, at the current point in time, we have definitely overcome the majority. So I am definitely sure that we have overcome about 60 to 80% of the current correction. Theoretically, as mentioned, there is still some room to go down. It could be that we touch 74,000 US dollars again, but nevertheless, in my opinion, the bull market is still intact. And I personally do not expect a summer slump 2.0 to occur. So in this regard, I just wanted to alleviate some of your concerns with numbers, data, and facts that I have presented. So I think you are definitely informed here. Otherwise, I sincerely thank you for your attention. And then we'll see each other again in the next video.